this webinar will be recorded. So in this webinar, we will have KYCC and TreePeople present on community-based social marketing approach. They studied and applied this approach in a community in South LA. They will present their findings and the steps they took to use this method for tree care. And then we're going to have Common Vision comment on social justice and communication aspects of this work. So Rachel and Edith, can you guys let us know what you guys do for your organization?
Certainly. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edith de Guzman, and I'm the Director of Research at LA-based TreePeople. And what TreePeople does, for those of you who are not aware of our work, is that we essentially work to inspire, engage, and support people to take personal responsibility for the urban environment. And we do that in a variety of different ways, both engaging with communities themselves and with engaging with government agencies. And in terms of the work that I do specifically at the organization, I run our research program, which is aimed essentially at finding the most effective and efficient ways to accelerate a sustainable transformation for Los Angeles. So for that, in order to do that, we essentially look at doing anything from identifying the best management practices out there for local water, extreme heat, and those sorts of climate impacts. But we're also intent on identifying practices for behavior change, so more of a social science approach, and that's what you'll be hearing about today. And my colleague Rachel Mallarich is joining us as well. Rachel, would you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Again, Rachel Mallarich, working with Koreatown Youth and Community Center. Our mission is to serve the evolving needs of the Korean American population in the greater LA area, as well as the multi-ethnic Koreatown community. It has evolved over time and is very diverse. Our programs and services are directed towards recently immigrated, economically disadvantaged youth and families, and promote community socioeconomic empowerment. So we have a lot of youth-based programming. We do prevention education. We have even a preschool and some affordable housing units. We have a lot of direct service that we provide to the Koreatown community. My unit is the environmental services team, and that group does graffiti removal in the community. We do a clean streets program where we do pickup of trash and weed abatement, and we do some community engagement to hear from the community what they want to see in the neighborhood, and we do tree planting and maintenance, which is obviously why I'm involved in this conversation about tree stewardship. We, over the summer, were responsible having contracts to water over 1,000 trees a week as just for a ballpark of the type of volume that we're working with on our maintenance contract side, not counting some of the non-contracted work that we've gotten through grants in terms of tree watering, which is, again, why I continue to be really interested in this issue. I'm also a certified arborist. So.
All right. So, Mariella, would you like us to go ahead and dive into our presentation?
Yes.
Great. All right. So please go ahead and advance to the second slide. So what you will be hearing today during the course of our presentation is we're going to start by sharing with you some of the challenges around urban forest stewardship and why we were particularly interested in pursuing this study. And you will understand what approach we took using community-based social marketing. This may be an approach that some of you are not familiar with, and through the course of our presentation, we're pretty confident that you'll understand what that entails. We will also tell you a bit about Huntington Park for those of you who are not from the Los Angeles area or are not familiar with this particular community. We want you to understand what some of the characteristics that make this community unique are, and perhaps have you think about whether some of the communities that you serve have some similarities. And we'll tell you about the project team, which was quite a large team. And the bulk of our presentation will be spent actually describing the study and sharing with you what the findings and implications of the study were. So go ahead and advance to the next slide, please.
So looking at the challenges of essentially tree care for urban forest stewardship, all of us who plant trees struggle with this issue of wanting the trees. You see in the slide one really vibrant, healthy looking tree and one that is not quite as healthy looking. And I can tell you that those trees were planted on the same day in 2007. They're approaching their 10-year anniversary in the ground. And obviously we want trees that are planted in that investment that we make in the communities to turn into shade that benefits our communities. But there's challenges to that. So first is in LA and in Southern California and also some in the rest of California, we all know that we need to water trees. We go for long periods of time without rainfall, particularly, April through October. We had an anomaly this morning with the little showers here in September in Los Angeles, but we have long period of time where there is no water, and young trees will not survive if they aren't given supplemental water. Secondly, obviously, we all are aware of the drought that we have been experiencing for the past several years that have been challenging for establishing young trees. There's pests that are really going after mature trees and causing even more stress in the urban forest. And lastly, it is much easier, in my experience, to find funding for planting trees. Everybody wants to hold the golden shovel and fund you to put the tree in the ground. It is much more challenging. We've definitely had advancements. There's been increases in fundings available through state grants and other mechanisms for establishment care, but it still doesn't match the level of funding that you can find available for planting. And it is a long-term thing. It isn't just a one-time cost. You're looking at 3 years or more of watering visits that you need to fund if you're going to have the establishment care done, and that's ongoing community engagement as well if you want to include the community in watering those trees.
All right, next slide, please. The approach that we used to take on this challenge of our urban forest stewardship is community-based social marketing, and you can see the steps in the slide, which will make more sense through the course of the presentation. But what sets CBSM apart from some of the other approaches is as follows. So when you think about behavior change campaigns, most of them are really aimed at providing information, because there's this concept that knowledge and awareness will change behavior. But there's a growing body of scientific research that shows that actually providing information rarely results in the adoption of green behavior. So community-based social marketing has emerged as an effective alternative to that traditional approach. And it's an approach that was developed by Dr. Doug Mackenzie Moore, who is a Canada-based environmental psychologist. So his approach of CBSM is based on social science research that demonstrates that behavior change is often most effectively achieved through initiatives that are delivered specifically at the community level. And those would be initiatives that focus on removing barriers to an activity while at the same time enhancing an activity's benefits. And again, this will make more sense as we describe what we did in Huntington Park. Next slide, please.
So speaking of Huntington Park, here you can see on a map that little dot where this community is located in southeast LA County. It's a 3 square mile community that is an incorporated, it's its own city. It is very densely populated and has a 95% population that is Latino. This is a community that also ranks very high on EnviroScreen. This is an area that has a lot of impacts from local freeways and different plants in the community of Vernon that's north of it, where there's a lot of industry. And so it was selected partly because of the environmental factors and social factors that are there, but also because TreePeople had been doing work with this community since 2010 and had built a really strong relationship with the city, who was committed to moving forward in growing their urban forest, and had identified with TreePeople up to 2,000 locations at that time when we were starting this study, around 2,000 locations for new trees, with the thought of, again, if we plant them, how are we going to get the community to buy in and really help us water them and make it so that we can, not instantly, obviously you want age diversity in your species, but start to move forward towards that goal of complete stocking of their street tree population. And so we had this really city that was on board with doing this, and then we'd also had huge volunteer involvement over time that had grown and grown and grown, and had a really strong volunteer base that would be able to help us with data gathering and providing feedback, as well as implementation with this long-term project in mind.
Next slide. In terms of the project team, I put this slide together to really encapsulate that, and I was surprised at how many people are listed on this. This was a project that took us some time to get off the ground just because of the availability of funding, and ultimately we had a really robust team that was composed of TreePeople as the lead of the project. We had wonderful support from the city of Huntington Park, which supported from anything from creating space for us to hold focus groups, to supporting us in the plantings and tree care events, to sending some of their electeds along. We worked with a firm called Action Research, which is a behavior change firm that specializes in community-based social marketing. They were instrumental in helping us through this. And we also worked with the California State University Northridge campus, specifically their anthropology department, which supported us through some of the data collection, specifically on the focus group pieces. And KYCC, of course, is also listed. So Rachel Mallarich was at one point with TreePeople, and we began this project together when she was employed here. And when she transitioned to KYCC, that organization was very supportive of her continuing to work on this important project with us. Next slide, please. And I mentioned that we had, an iterative process of getting funding for this and being able to actually put time and effort toward this. And all of that would not have been possible without us obtaining that funding. So specifically, we are very grateful for the support that we got from the LA Center for Urban Natural Resources Sustainability, Boeing, and the Dorrance Family Foundation, which came in at different stages of this process in order to provide the funding necessary for us to complete the study. Next slide. So we are going to walk you through what we actually did. So the first step in CBSM is to select your target audience and your target behavior. And for that, I would say that for really the entire team that worked on this, we had a lot of, it was a learning experience for us in many ways. So for example, we had to really break down our assumptions that we knew who we were working with and that we were creating programs that worked for those audiences, because the public is not an audience. It's a multiple, there's a multiplicity of audiences within that. For us, what we ended up identifying is that our specific audience was residents whose home is adjacent to a newly planted street tree. And in this particular case, a resident could be someone who lives in either a single family home or multifamily housing, and it could be an owner or a renter. And similarly, the idea of tree care, that's really not a behavior. So in community-based social marketing, you're looking to define a behavior that is non-divisible, that is, it can't be broken down further, and end state. End state means that it really produces the desired environmental outcomes that you're seeking. So when we broke down tree care, we identified that we were actually talking about 4 different things with different frequencies. First, we were asking people to check the soil moisture of their tree on a weekly basis. And if they found that it was necessary to water it, to go ahead and water it. So that's the second behavior. The third behavior was to check the need for removing of weeds monthly and then going ahead and removing them if needed. And then in a similar vein, to check twice a year whether mulch was sufficient and adding mulch if necessary.
And my other tree planters may note that staking and pruning and removing of suckers are all not included. And let me tell you, we had plenty of robust conversations around which behaviors we were going to tackle in this piece. And ultimately, really, the water piece we know is the make or break issue on whether or not the tree is going to make it to the next day. So we focused in on these, but I definitely know that there are pieces of tree care that we did not include in this.
Next slide. Okay, so once we had our audience and behaviors identified, we needed to then understand what the benefits and barriers are around those particular behaviors for this specific audience.
And I'll just say that when we started this, again, TreePeople had been engaged in this community for several years at this point. And one of the things with CBSM that's really important is that you need to take, and Edith already alluded to this, you need to take any assumptions you have about what you know about your demographics and your audience and erase them from your brain. You need to be really willing to step back and say, we're going to go through a really thorough process to understand how people are viewing this behavior, rather than saying, well, I think I've talked to enough community members that I know. This is a really rigorous way of listening to what the community really thinks and feels.
And so with that in mind, we started, we went about doing research on the benefits and barriers in a few different ways. The first thing we did is we conducted a very thorough literature review, both on Huntington Park specifically, looking at their demographics, at their cultural characteristics, and what defines this community. And we also looked more broadly at literature looking at engagement with resident communities on tree care. So we looked at things like attitudes toward urban trees and urban tree programs. We looked at what the motivation to participate in voluntary environmental stewardship behaviors might be, and what the literature showed around that. And we also looked at what the motivation to plant trees or participate in tree planting programs specifically is. Next slide. In addition to a literature review, we conducted focus groups. And I should say that the focus groups came after the literature review because we wanted to feel like we were sufficiently informed to conduct these in an effective way. We conducted 2 separate focus groups with about 12 to 15 members of the community in each of them. One included individuals who were currently conducting or doing some tree care, whether it was with TreePeople in volunteer events or even at their own home. The other group was a group that had individuals that don't currently do any kind of tree care. And the reason for splitting that up is that we didn't want people in the non-tree care group to feel marginalized or feel like they weren't, engaged in a behavior that they should be. We're very interested in having people be able to communicate whatever was on their mind and whatever their perceptions were without feeling like they were being judged. And the findings from those 2 separate focus groups on the tree care and non-tree care groups was that by and large, in both groups, we found that trees are valued by the community, but that there's also a perception that they're not problem-free, that they cause litter, that they might buckle sidewalks, and that they're not an asset that doesn't come with some burden. There is also a perception in both of those community or both of those groups that there are just not enough trees in the community, that they would like to have more in their neighborhood. And then we found a couple of very interesting findings that helped inform the rest of our study. One was that there is a perception by and large that the city is responsible for care, so that it's somebody else's responsibility to care for that tree. And there was also a perception that tree care, and specifically watering, is expensive. So that gave us a lot of information that we then put into our next step. So go ahead and bring us to the next slide, please, Mariella. And that next step was a series of surveys. These were administered by youth in the community with staff supervision. We ended up getting 88 households to respond to our survey, and it was a fairly thorough survey. We did offer some compensation to the respondents to encourage them to actually stay with us for what ended up being several minutes of questioning. And here we're going to share with you some of the outcomes. Again, this is all aimed at identifying benefits and barriers. So in terms of looking at attitudes toward trees, here we asked people essentially how much do they agree or disagree with each of the statements that you see. And because you see that everything is between 6 and 7, it means that people have very positive attitudes toward trees. Anything from trees are beautiful to look at, to it's important to have trees in the neighborhood, and an understanding of drought requiring more care for trees. So this was a very good finding. Attitudes toward trees were very positive in this community. Next slide. We also wanted to identify whether there were actually any physical barriers to watering. So is there infrastructure for watering in this community? And we were pleased to see that by and large, yes, there is. Most people have a spigot in the front yard with a hose that attaches that reaches the parkway. So that means that, that if we're asking them to do something, regardless of perception, in terms of the physical conditions required, those conditions are in existence. So it's a good thing. Next slide, please. Now we wanted to also understand a little bit around what the barriers or perceived or actual barriers are in this community. And the couple of barriers that emerged as the most significant echoed what we heard in the focus groups. Namely, that it's the responsibility of the city to care for trees. And secondly, that people don't want to pay for the water needed, and that's tied to a perception that it's expensive to do so. You can see that there are a number of other barriers, but those were really the two significant ones. Next slide. And this again echoes the positive perceptions that there are around trees and specifically around tree care. So there is a high perception of a positive aspect to performing tree care in this community. So you can see that all of the statements received a high ranking. Anything from looking at taking care of trees will make the street or a yard look nice, or wanting to have people outside. So this was, again, a very good thing, because we don't want to go into a community and ask them to do something around some sort of an asset that is not valued. Next slide. And lastly, for the surveys, and I should say we do have a lot more findings, but we're just highlighting some of the most meaningful survey findings. We also wanted to understand, from the community's perspective, would they be more likely to water their tree if a community group like TreePeople or KYCC asked them to do so, or would they be more likely to water their tree if the city were to ask them? And this really speaks to who is the messenger and deliverer of your program. And we found that in both categories, either the city or a community group, there wasn't much of a difference. We found that folks in the community were either somewhat likely or very likely to go ahead and water their tree in either of the scenarios.
And I would add, next slide. And I would add that one of the things that when we were being trained on CBSM, that was one of the things that was indicated as being pretty important, is identifying a trusted source to be the deliverer of the message or the program that was developed to move towards the behavior change in the community. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we developed based on what we heard from the community. So if I were to show, as you see all these materials, they may seem like a random assortment if you were to just open the bag that we use to give to the community and see them. But I'm going to explain a little bit about why we selected what we selected. This first one is our instructional magnet. So this is one that we saw people being able to put on their fridge as one, a how-to in English and Spanish, how to water your tree. Secondly, as a prompt or reminder to go and engage in that behavior. And third, to address this barrier of the cost of watering trees. So you have very simply the behavior we'd like them to engage in. It's in a form that they could put on their fridge where they can see it on a regular basis. And then at the bottom, you see we have the carton of eggs, and communicate this message. Did you know it costs only $5 a year to water your tree as much as a carton of eggs. And this is something that if a future community was going to use it, you might want to consider what is an applicable, and if this is a barrier, you know, watering being expensive, what's an appropriate image for that. We worked with our community organizer there, and we're talking about a couple, you know, 2 gallons of milk, or, you know, what's an appropriate thing, and we decided on a carton of eggs, which conveniently has 12, like the 12 months of the year. So one egg a month, that's how much it's costing you. Next slide. Here we have the biggest surprise, I think, in our toolkit, this air freshener. So again, we wanted to think of what is a reminder that would happen on this, that would connect with a weekly activity that they're already doing. And when we originally were approaching this project, I'll put out there, you know, I was convinced that it was going to be trash day. You know, we roll up our trash cans on one day a week, you know, and the trash gets picked up. But in this community, the trash bins are actually in the rear of the home, and you don't actually roll out a bin. There's large trash receptacles that the truck comes down the alleys and collects from. So that wasn't an appropriate behavior. But it's a very pedestrian heavy community where most people are walking, but a lot of people do have cars, and they move them once a week for street sweeping. Hence, we have our air freshener as a prompt. When they get in their car to move their car for street sweeping, they have this waiting there reminding them, have you checked me this week? Of course, the weekly behavior we wanted was them checking their tree to see if it needs being watered, and then watering it if it did. Next slide. Here we have our commitment sticker. So one of the thoughts behind community-based social marketing is you're trying to build a new social norm and have social diffusion. So have something start with a portion of the community and then spread out from there through building this norm in the neighborhood. And so this is a static cling sticker that we had hoped people would put in their front windows if they committed to watering their tree, and have that be as a visual of the social norm that we're building. I'll add that the image we have here was developed by one of our Huntington Park interns, which was part of the team on this project. And the students voted and selected this as the image for the sticker. Next slide. So we put all these things together in a packet. You can see the 3 that I've addressed, along with a letter. And in that letter, we worded the text to very specifically highlight the benefits that we heard from the community, as well as to directly address that the city actually doesn't have the capacity to water trees, and if we want more trees in our community, we need help, and that it isn't that expensive. Those same kind of messages, we tried to keep it. There's 100 reasons why we all plant trees and things that they're important, but this letter and the script that we also developed off of it, we wanted to hone in on what we had heard, not just trees are great and they make our streets look beautiful and they capture stormwater and reduce heat island effect. We narrowed it down to just the points that the community had already emphasized to us were important to them. Next slide. So how do we get this information into the hands of people? Here's a picture with some of our youth volunteers who, as Edith mentioned, were part of the door-to-door delivery of the survey, where they paired up in teams and went door to door and asked the questions in person and recorded answers. But we also trained them to deliver the message that was in the script and the letter, and to go through the materials, ultimately leading to asking the homeowner if they would be willing to commit to watering their tree. And so the way we delivered this program was we developed 2 pilots. One where we were doing an in-person engagement as part of a tree care event. So we sent out youth to knock on doors and see if they could engage with the homeowner, if the homeowner answered their door, and talk to them about watering their tree, and then being willing to show them how to water their tree. If they didn't open the door, we did tree care on the tree and hoped that that attracted their attention on a Saturday morning, and if they came out, engaged with them. So we did an in-person delivery, and then the second group went door to door and just hung up the bags. We just had those little bags with all the materials in it, and we hung them on the door. And we really wanted to see if there was a difference between the in-person delivery, which is more time intensive. You know, a lot of groups struggle with capacity for doing that kind of engagement where you're deeply engaging with the homeowner. And honestly, we want to know, is hanging it on the door enough? Because it is a significant difference in staff or volunteer time required to make that happen. So this is a perfect opportunity to test whether or not that was worth the additional investment, doing the door-to-door piece. Next slide. So here we have some of the youth out there doing the tree care in person, and on the right we have my team that we're walking and just dropping off the bags at the different homes. And so we had about 30 trees, right, Edith, in one pilot area that received the direct interaction with the youth and our staff, and then about 30 trees in 36.
36 in each of the two groups.
So 36 and 36, and then 36 that just received the materials with no in-person delivery. Next slide. I will just note that when we were dropping off the bags, we ran into many barriers. We did not go through any gates if they were locked, or even if they were closed. We just left them on the front entrance. So that was one challenge in that form of delivery, at least in this community. Next slide. So we went out and we delivered it, and then the real work began, and Edith's going to share this.
That's right. So after our pilot, which happened all on one day with the groups going out and either engaging with the one group of residents or just dropping off the materials, our team then began 6 weeks of observation. And what that entailed was every 2 days, they were going out and taking soil moisture readings with a moisture sensor. So that happened several times a week because it was every two days. And the idea there was we wanted to have an objective and fairly unobtrusive approach to looking at whether or not the behavior was changing. Now, on a weekly basis, so while the teams were out there, we also were taking some other observations. Specifically, we had the teams look at the presence of mulch and the presence of weeds and mark that down. We also had them rate tree health overall, so the trunk, branch, and leaf health, and then also take photos of the tree for documentation purposes. And if there were any other issues, we asked them to note those as well. Next slide. After that 6-week evaluation process, we had some data. So you can see here that we collected baseline data. So that is before the materials were distributed. And then we have sort of a weekly read on where things were at in general. And I should note that we're sharing just some of the observations, and you know, hoping that we'll be sharing the most pertinent ones for our audience. Soil moisture, as Rachel mentioned, is it's really the key indicator. And what we see here is that the orange line represents how moist the soil was for the active group. That is the group that had that in-person interaction. And we can see that the soil moisture in that group was in fact higher than what we found in the passive group that did not receive the in-person interaction. Next slide. We also looked at tree health. So here first we're looking at passive outreach. So again, this is a group that did not receive the in-person interaction. And what we can see is it was mostly fair tree health. And there might be changes through a 6-week period, whether or not you have more or less leaves and so on. And of course, this is to some extent subject to an interpretation by whomever is taking those readings. But you can see by and large we're looking at fair. Next slide. This contrasts with the active outreach group. So we can see that depending on the week, sometimes it was most of the trees were identified as being in fair condition, but we also see that many more of the trees had a good rating. So this is a good thing as well. Next slide. So what does it all mean? And again, we're only showing you some of the outcomes here, but suffice it to say, what we learned at the end of this limited period of 6 weeks is that active in-person outreach compared to passive did have better outcomes. Soil was significantly more moist, there was more mulch, and there was better observed tree health. However, it's important to note that both active and passive groups actually had better outcomes than pre-outreach baseline. So doing anything in terms of engaging and educating and trying to remove the barriers and boost the benefits is a good thing relative to doing nothing. Next slide.
So, oh, I thought we'd had this one, sorry. So what's next? Well, we have a journal article that's currently in peer review. We're sharing the findings here with you all and continuing to do that in venues where we see appropriate. And then ultimately, my dream has been since the beginning to do further implementation and testing of these strategies and what we learned through this process in other areas. TreePeople and KYCC belong to the City Plants Collaborative, and that group plants a large volume of trees every year. And that was one of my goals, was being able to provide really great information that could inform that group and other groups that work in Southern California and across California as applicable. So in one of the grants that KYCC is working on right now, we are looking at a larger volume of trees in a specific geographic area where we have some maintenance funding, but I'm interested to see how far we can go with that funding in terms of having greater success and survival rates with trees and more healthy trees than just surviving trees through utilizing some of these methods. Particularly as, again, we try and shift neighborhoods that maybe are not as welcoming towards trees, towards being more excited about trees or having more trees in their neighborhood. So Edith and I are actually working together on what that might look like for the KYCC project that I'm working on as an opportunity to test this further, this type of engagement and tree care outcomes with a group of around 400 trees, most likely. And we're catching it at the beginning of the project. So we're going to be able to really watch over the reporting period for that, that grant to see if some of these pieces work. Again, with the thought, more highly engaged community, I always think is good. I think that trees bring communities together. And if we can get them to change this behavior, again, we have a better outcome when we look at our trees. So building that social norm of tree care across LA through this methodology, hopefully, and really trying to further refine. I obviously will be changing some things. It may not be an air freshener. I may choose some different graphics based on what we hear from the community, but that's ultimately what we're looking at, is seeing how we can move forward in utilizing this tool.
And our contact information is on the last slide, as well as a website that I encourage you all to check out, CBSM.com. CBSM.com is a very rich resource for anyone who's interested in pursuing a CBSM project. In fact, the sort of the Bible for CBSM is a book called Fostering Sustainable Behavior, and it's fully available electronically on the website for free. There's also a wonderful forum where many people have posted questions as well as case studies, and very rich discussion around applying CBSM to different types of behavior change programs. So I encourage you all to take a look at that. And again, if you're looking for a firm that can help sort of hold your hand through the process, Action Research is an excellent organization that's based here in California that would be willing to help. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Edith and Rachel. So just a reminder for everyone, we will ask questions at the end of both presentations. And now we're going to have Common Vision present. As you saw, in every aspect of this CBSM steps, your organization will have to engage with the community. So that's why we're going to have some commentary on social justice and how to communicate with community members from Common Vision. So,
great. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Marielle, and thank you, Edith and Rachel, for your presentation and also the deep work you've done. That was what a giant project, and what an offering to the urban forestry community. My name is Michael Flynn. I'm the executive director of Common Vision. For the last 14 years now, we've been working with low-income schools across the state of California, planting and maintaining school orchards. We have about 250 schools with fruit trees currently. And what we're bringing to the table today is rooted in some of our own journey as an organization. We're a primarily white organization working with a whole variety of communities, primarily with students of color. And we had quite a learning curve in identifying kind of the role of race, power, privilege, and what our responsibilities as white educators and visitors to these communities really were. And so this, so a lot of our work in this kind of anti-racism field has been developing trainings to make sure that all of the educators that we bring onto the schoolyard really understand context, understand how to show up respectfully, and a lot of that is understanding the blind spots, places that are hard to see as white folks thinking about race or working in an interracial situation where where it's really the awareness of some different kind of pitfalls and patterns and unequal outcomes really can shape how interactions take place in a more respectful way. And we also have Ray.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ray Stubblefield-Tave. I'm the Program Director of Common Vision. I started out as a volunteer back in 2015 and came on as a Program Director at the start of this year. In terms of my background and what I bring to the table, I am a person of color. I'm actually the first person of color to help participate in our anti-racism trainings that we do with our volunteers. As Michael said, we've been historically a primarily white organization. My father is also an anti-racism and diversity trainer. And so I'm a second generation person doing these trainings. We've been doing these trainings, as Michael said, for a number of years with our volunteers within the organization. And we've also been bringing it out to some other organizations by request as well, including Relief. We also worked with a local public school this year that we've had a relationship with. And we're also bringing our expertise to a number of conferences, including the upcoming Permaculture Convergence this year. Marielle, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you.
Great, and we're going to move fairly quickly. We have about kind of 10 minutes, so we're going to be pointing to some kind of areas of potential blind spots. First, looking at kind of this CBSM process as a whole, both looking at potential blind spots that organizations should be aware of, and also ways in which the CBSM process actually kind of brings bias to the forefront and kind of helps organizations understand a little bit more about bias they might be carrying. Secondly, we're going to discuss the importance of anti-racism training for white staff and volunteers. This is something that for many of the organizations that at least the ones that I could tell based on the attendees, have done some thinking around this, and I think it's a really important question for all of us who are doing this work. And lastly, looking at further resources, be they trainings or internet resources for organizations and individuals to look at to go a little deeper. Next slide, please. I believe this
So
is
Mariella, this is where we're going to go to the first poll. So we're going to do two very quick polls. As Michael said, we're going to be moving at a fast clip. So if you can fill out this first poll, the question is, are the members of your organization and team from the community you're serving? So that can include your volunteers, as well as unpaid and paid staff and leadership. So we'll just give you a quick minute to fill that out. And Mariella, go ahead and let us know, or just click to the results once they're filled out.
Okay, so
These are some that
there's 60% people have voted. Please, everyone vote. And once everyone has voted, I will close the polling.
And this is partially just a pretty basic question to be asking ourselves, as well as some more information for us in terms of who's attending the webinar. So I think we can go ahead and close that out with the information we have. So in looking at that results, so we have about an 80-20 split. So about 80% say that members are from the community they're serving, and about 20% are not from the community they're serving primarily. Can we go to the next poll? So go ahead and fill this one out as well. So this second piece is, do the racial demographics of your organization or team mirror those of the community you are serving? Again, that can be volunteers, unpaid, paid staff, and leadership. And so these questions may look similar, and obviously they intersect, but they are quite different. You can have folks from outside or inside the community, and racially they may or may not mirror the demographics of your community. So Mariella, we can close that poll whenever we have the info. Thank you. So if we look at these questions, they're a little bit different. Here with our results, about 43% say that the demographics do mirror the community, and about 57% say no. So that's a higher jump in looking at there is more of a racial gap there than a from the community gap. Can we go to the next slide, Mariella? And so these are just important baseline questions to be asking yourself about the community. The more of a discrepancy there is between the community you're serving and the more organization, the more blind spots there might be, the more nuanced conversations to be having. And this especially is as we go up the food chain of organizations. If we look at the racial breakdowns, for many organizations, it's a general trend. You might have folks of color who are at the volunteer level or the more entry-level positions. And as you get higher and higher up the leadership chain at many organizations, it tends to be whiter and whiter. So that's just something to pay attention to as well. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes, Michael?
I was just seeing if we can go to the next slide on the.
It's on impact, right?
On the presentation. Yeah, I think we have the quick poll in front of us currently.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
There we are.
Do you see impact?
All right, I think we're one before that. Fantastic, thanks so much. In kind of beginning to talk about kind of anti-racist lens, it is there's for those who have for folks of color in the webinar today, it's been something you've been thinking about and experiencing all your life. For white folks in the webinar, you may or may not have a background in doing a lot of thinking about this. So there's a lot to cover for those in the second category if there's if it's a lot of new material. But one of our most important kind of tenets or looking at things through an anti-racist lens is the ability to differentiate between intent and impact. Yourself being the expert of what your intention is, and the rest of the folks in the room or in the community being those that are the expert of the impact. Next slide, please. And this, for time, we can actually skip again to the next slide after. Oh, we must have skipped. So, point being in intent and impact, we're generally assuming good intentions on the part of all the volunteers, all the staff, and often there are different impacts, especially like you said, when we have white folks working with communities of color, that there are things to be aware of the way that you might show up differently. the way that things that you might either take for granted or you might be doing with the intention of creating connection might have an effect that is different than that. So we're going to hop in to looking at the potential blind spots and some of the ways that CBSM actually helps us to look at bias in a different way, and conclude shortly thereafter, because we have just a short window here.
Wonderful. And we'll be going back to intent and impact a little bit throughout this list. Essentially, what's at stake if your intent and your impact don't line up is you're not quite doing the work and the mission that you probably want to do. And oftentimes there can be a loss of trust as well. If you're having a moment where you're meaning to make connection and really you're just relating to your own story or your background instead of listening to the folks and taking impact from the folks in the community that you're working with. So we're going to go ahead and jump into identifying blind spots at each step. So the first step is the community selection and planning process. So if we think about those 2 poll questions that we asked, this is especially important to do work around if you have folks who are working in a community that are not originally from that community, or white folks working in communities of color, or just folks that don't match up racially to the community that they're working in. So before you really get into the actual work that you do, there's the community selection and there's the community trust building. So when you're in this initial step, this is really the time where you can go to work, see what the community needs, go to the community meetings, go to the community events, identify the leaders in the community and ask them what the work is that they need assistance with. What is the work that's already being done? What are the most valuable knowledge and expertise and resources that you can bring to the community? And this is where you want to take, as the other folks mentioned, you want to take your assumptions off the table as much as possible. Ask them what they actually need instead of just assuming that you can bring this thing that may or may not be helpful. And this is also where you want to take things into context. So this is not just the context of your organization working with this community and city. This is also taking things into context of the environmental movement, which is historically quite white. And so these folks may have had this conversation with outside organizations many times before, even if you're having this conversation for the first time. So if there are other orgs doing work within the community, ask them about their successes and failures and learn from them as much as possible. On to the focus group, Michael.
Indeed. So something that I really was excited to see in the CBSM process is that it takes the assumption that our biases, that we have biases and they may or may not be correct. I think that is in some ways the baseline steps for anti-racism and diversity work, is understanding some underlying biases, also understanding some patterns that show up again and again. For example, something from our own learning curve, we noticed that quite a lot of our educators would really attempt to point out and focus on ways in which their experience was the same from the communities in which they were working. And while this had the intention of kind of creating connection, common ground, it turns out that kind of being that colorblind and blind to make more connection is a pattern that shows up and is easy to read through, is often kind of especially if it has this kind of bypassing the issues of difference piece to it, can really show up as a kind of an untrustworthy, unthought about, like having not really deeply considered kind of how race plays a part, how context and culture plays a part. And so we really appreciate the CBSM model, and in the focus group, it's a great opportunity to, especially because it's science-based. You're really looking to create that that non-biased angle that in working with folks from the community in different, in this case, the tree group and non-tree group, you're really able to isolate and get a sense from the community's perspective of what's most important. Survey process?
Yep, onto the survey process in our last couple minutes. So something that we love, as you can see, that worked really well with this study that we're looking at, is that they were able to utilize folks from the community, the students. So that has an immediate buy-in from the community. It's folks doing work for their own community. Those folks were able to be involved. They may already speak the language, whether that's Spanish and English, or just having the community shorthand in terms of needs. So if you can get a group involved like that, that's great. If you can't and you're a visitor to the community, just be transparent and position yourself as a visitor. We always advise levels of transparency with that. It's okay if there's differences in between the folks who are doing the surveying and the folks who are participating, as long as you're clear and transparent in that aspect. On to the next steps, Michael.
And for the purpose of time, let's hop right to community and neighborhood events.
Wonderful. So looking at that last bullet point for community and neighborhood events. Again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, if there are town hall meetings, community meetings, other work days or community cleanup days, participate in those, see what those are run like, see how effective those are, see if you can partner with and combine those days. If the community already has buy-in there, is already taking time out of their schedules, maybe you can link those events together and work together. If you can't, just take an examination of what you need in order to have those events be successful, whether that's are they accessible to public transportation, ride sharing, food, water, monetary or gift card compensations, all things that were talked about with the folks earlier. Also things to be aware of. It seems simple. If you're a white person and you don't normally speak in Ebonics, now is not probably the time to bring that behavior to the table. It seems silly, but we do see it often with folks wanting to build commonalities where there is a difference. And don't just be there to teach, be there to learn as well. Folks may have more of a background, whether that's in agriculture, gardening, knowledge that you may not know about. So really be there to learn as well as teach. And last slide, we'll just leave those up for some resources through Relief. That's a link to our presentation, as well as Jose Gonzalez from Latino Outdoors. And there's a link for an implicit bias test and checking your privilege test as well, which is not just for white folks, it's for all of us, since we all have bias and privilege. I think that'll be our wrap up, Mariela, since we're at time.
Okay, so just some questions. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and I will unmute you. Rachel and Edith, we have a question for you from David. His question is, how did you approach Boeing to get funding?
That would probably be a question for our grants department, but I can tell you that we have a very long history of working with Boeing on a variety of different kinds of projects and programs, and this was one that they were interested in particular in supporting within this long history of support that they've provided us.
That's great.
David, I'll say this, if you want to contact me via my email, I can put you in contact with our grants folks.
So I have another question for KYCC and TreePeople. If someone wants to recreate this in their community, what did you wish you knew at the beginning of this project?
That's an excellent question. I would say we were fully wide-eyed about the fact that this was going to be a really substantial project and that it was going to require an intense commitment, both of time and resources. And I think we also knew that it was going to have to be an iterative process for us, that we weren't going to be able to just pack everything into 3 to 6 months, but that we were going to have to do it as those resources became available. For my part, one thing that I do wish I would have known is that when we set our observation protocols, once we did our engagement of the community, I wish that we would have set a few more data points as things that we would have collected. In other words, we actually didn't put into our evaluation observation protocols any observations around whether or not people were actually using the products or the program materials that we had given them. So did they in fact hang their air fresheners in their vehicles? Did they in fact put the commitment sticker in their living room window, etc.? So that's one thing that going forward, if we were to do this again, I think we'll have a more comprehensive set of observations.
And I would add, similarly, if when we implement this again with some changes based on community feedback from the organizations we're working with in the neighborhood, I'm going to be utilizing it in. Oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, the data collection. The every other day for 6 weeks, I would rather do a longer time period with doing like something slightly less frequent, obviously because it's really time intensive, but being able to look at tree health and soil moisture, but more specifically looking at the progression of tree health over maybe a 12-month period of those trees that are participating in a pilot. So that's something that I really like to do, just try differently since I have that flexibility, as well as there's a couple survey questions that we wished, even though we had expert help in crafting our survey, there's a couple where we got an answer, but it wasn't quite as much information as we realized that it answered part of the question, but it didn't answer another piece of why they might have felt a certain way. And so there's some survey questions I would just say to those doing it, think about what kind of information might change the strategies you employ to change behavior, and make sure that you're asking all the questions you need to really understand that aspect. We asked a lot of questions, we got a lot of great information, but there's just a couple tweaks I would make if I was going back.
So I have a question for Michael and Ray. Through the CBSM approach, organizers will have to interact with community throughout the whole process. Is there a training you would recommend for an organization to go through?
Sure, this is Ray, I'll take that one. So we really recommend for organizations, but especially primarily white organizations, to just continue doing the work and the research and asking the questions and listening. In terms of specific trainings, on our resources slide, you can go to Relief's diversity resources, as I mentioned. So we do have a recording of the full anti-racism trainings that we've done for Relief that's available, as well as Jose Gonzalez speaking. So those are available. And if there is an organization that's interested in contacting us about the training, it's not the main piece of what we do, although we're happy to have that conversation. And I would also really recommend, again, talking to organizations that are in the area in terms of the work that they've already done, what's worked, what hasn't. I would really start with those community-based conversations first, and then from there, certainly you can always contact professional trainers, and depending on the area, we may also have some local folks who might be available and might be a good fit. In terms of contacting us for a conversation or just as a recommendation, our website is commonvision.org, and my email is ray@commonvision.org, and Michael's is michael@commonvision.org. So you can certainly find us there.
So someone asked if this recording will be linked somewhere. Yes, it will be linked on our website, and I will also send you an e-blast about it. Another question for Edith and Rachel. Did you only include homeowners in your CBSM tree care study, or renters too?
Yeah, as Edith indicated earlier on in our presentation, it did not matter if you were a renter or homeowner, and it didn't matter if you were a multifamily property or a single family home. It was just any resident of the community with a tree in that street tree location that was young.
Another question, what process do you implement to water 1,000 trees a week? This is from Matt.
So I've got a wonderful team in my department. I think at this point we have, 7 staff that go out in trucks every day. I have crews working 7 days a week, partly because of our graffiti contract, and those are additional staff members, but I do have some people doing tree care almost every day of the week. And that's great that we are able to provide jobs. A number of my staff are, live in the community and, this is their home and they get to go and take care of trees where they live and have a full-time job. So we do volunteer engagement at KYCC. We do have volunteer events for doing community cleanups and tree planting and tree care. But I also have the ability to blend that with paid crews who can go out and, have a water tank on the back of the truck and a hose that they then, go and stop at each tree and water and, adjust stakes and do mulch and weeding and all that good stuff.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? I don't see anyone else's questions. I know we went over the time, sorry about that. It looks like no one else has any more questions. So I think we should wrap it up. How does that sound for everyone? Oh, one more question from Matt. Do you have partnerships with your city for KYCC and TreePeople?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
Multiple cities. Yeah. So, Matt, I don't know if you're LA based or not, but LA County has 88 cities plus unincorporated areas, so 89 jurisdictions. And while a lot of the work that TreePeople does is within the city of LA, we have a lot of other jurisdictions that we work with, and Huntington Park is one example.
And with KYCC, again, we're part of that tree planting collaborative City Plants, which, to get permits to plant trees, et cetera, we work directly with the city to do that. As well as, we're a general contractor. We work for the Office of Community Beautification. That's where our graffiti contract comes in. So yes, we work very closely with the city for all of our activities.
By the way, Matt is from the Bay Area, Richmond to be specific.
I'm originally from the Bay too.
Any more questions? I don't see any more questions. So like I said, sorry everyone, we went over our 1 hour limit. I think that's a wrap. Thank you everyone for attending and staying through this webinar. Thank you to the presenters, Rachel, Edith, Ray, and Michael for taking the time to do this. And just again, this webinar is recorded and I will send everyone an email to be able to view the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, California Relief, for hosting this. We really appreciate being invited.
You're welcome.
Thank you all so much.
Okay, bye, everyone.